Right. It's a very great pleasure to be with you this evening, with the Trollope Society, and a pleasure for me to talk about the Prime Minister, to revisit the Prime Minister, because as Dom said, I did an edition of it in 2011 for World Classic. Well, Trollope wrote the Prime Minister, as you probably know, between the 2nd of April and the 15th of September 1874, at the rate of slightly more than 3 chapters a week, 24 weeks, mostly in his new or newish home at 39 Montague Square, Marylebone in London, also during a long summer holiday in Germany, Switzerland and Austria in August and the first half of September. His publisher, Chapman & Hall, set type and printed pages during the autumn and winter of 1874 to 75, and Trollope returned the last of the corrected proofs on the 26th of February 1875, by which time, in Trollope, he was, of course, 3/4 of the way through the writing of his next novel, T. Popenjoy. As he did so, as he returned the proofs, that is, he reminded Frederick Chapman that, I quote, "the Prime Minister is to come out in 8 parts, and each part to contain 10 chapters. The first part is to appear in October." The event, the 8-part issues, each costing 5 shillings, appeared at monthly intervals between November 1875 and June 1876. This was a new and unusual format for the publication of novels, invented by G.H. Lewes, George Eliot's novel Middlemarch in 1871-2. Many Victorian novels were, of course, first published in monthly parts. But following the successful example of Dickens's Pickwick Papers in 1836-7, the parts were much shorter, only 32 pages, were issued over a period of 20 months, rather than 8, cost only 1 shilling rather than 5 shillings, and would subsequently be republished as 3-volume books. The Prime Minister, by contrast, would appear in May 1876 as a 4-volume. It's a long novel, as you've discovered. Lewes may said have invented this new format in order to make piracy by unauthorized American publishers more difficult. It also suited his partner, George Eliot, and a friend, Anthony Trollope, at a stage of their careers when they wished to conceive and write novels on a larger, more ambitious scale. Eliot would use it again for Daniel Deronda, published in 8 parts and then 4 volumes in 1876, and Trollope would attempt to use it for The Duke's Children. His publisher refused, and he was obliged to cut it down for serialization in All the Year Round in 1879-80 and conventional 3-volume publication in 1880. Though, as Dom has just said, we do now have the restored full 4-volume text in print, restored from Trollope's manuscript, original manuscript. With the Prime Minister, he was not thus obliged to compromise, and 10-chapter, half-volume, as they were called, sections are the form in which Trollope intended his original readers to encounter and consider this story. Well, I begin with this rather dry biographical detail because I want to think about Trollope's technique in the Prime Minister and the contemporary context in which he was exercising or applying it. The distinct mode of publication for which he was creating his fiction is one such context. How well or badly do the 8 parts or 4 volumes work as episodes, sections, story? What effect does the need to arrange his material into these units have upon the narrative? How well, in other words, is the novel constructed? This, if you like, is the practical or technical context of the Prime Minister. But there is, of course, also a political context for this novel. We talk Trollope's lesser series as his political novels, and they are all set in or set close to the world of 19th century parliamentary politics. They were not, however, planned in advance as a series or published as such in his lifetime. Though Trollope referred in his autobiography to a series of semi-political tales, unquote, not including Can You Forgive Her, and In a letter written to Henry Howard in 1881 to, I quote, a series of novels, not including the Eustace Diamond, about, quote, family of the Pallisers, they seem not to have been issued as the parliamentary series until the early 20th century. Actually, I think first in America, as far as I can see, in an edition published in Philadelphia. And they only became widely known as the Palliser series after the BBC television dramatisation of 1874. Significantly, I think, only two of them have titles which suggest that they will contain political or parliamentary material, and in one of those cases it is merely a subtitle, Aeneas Finn, subtitle Irish Member. One clear and prominent declaration of a political topic is, of course, Prime Minister, which wears its heart literally on its sleeve or book jacket and tells us immediately we're about to encounter parliamentary issues and events. So, what is the political context? This novel written in the spring and summer of 1874. I argued in the appendix, which I wrote for the Oxford World Classics edition of the whole Palliser series in 2011, and I quote myself, I'm afraid, forgive me, Trollope refracts rather than reflects the political circumstances of his time, and does so with a combination of mild archaism and deliberate distortion, unquote. What that means in the case of the Prime Minister is that he takes a real event from the first half of the 1850s, coalition government of 1852-55, in which Lord Hamilton Gordon, Earl of Aberdeen, had served as Prime Minister, and moves it into the political circumstances of the early 1870s. There had, it's true, been a state of political deadlock in 1873, the year before Trollope embarked on this novel. Gladstone's Liberal government lost a vote on their Irish University Bill on the 12th of March 1873, splitting the Parliamentary Liberal Party in the process. And the Queen had invited Disraeli to form a Conservative administration. Disraeli declined because he preferred to wait for a general election in which he might achieve a majority of votes in the Commons. So the Liberals limped on until they opted to go to the country in February 1874. Trollope, of course, started writing his novel just a month later. This was, as they say, a lame duck. It wasn't a coalition, and it was succeeded not by a reunited Liberal Party, as in Trollope's novel, by a Conservative administration under Disraeli, which would stay in office the rest of the decade. Aberdeen coalition, by contrast, had been a real coalition of Whigs, like Conservatives, and radical free traders. It was succeeded by a reunited Whig or Liberal Party, in that case under Palmerston. One, I suppose, might add that the issue on which Plantagenet Palliser's government falls, the, I quote, new county suffrage bill, is more or less the issue on which Lord John Russell's Whig government had fallen in March 1851. And also perhaps recollect that Lord Aberdeen, who died in 1860, was remembered for, I quote, his dour, awkward, occasionally sarcastic exterior, unquote, his struggle to manage the big beasts in his cabinet, Russell, Gladstone, Palmerston, and for his observation after stepping down that, I quote, I do not know how I shall bear being out of office. I have many resources and many objects of interest, but after being occupied with great affairs, it is not easy to subside to the level of common occupations, unquote. That, I think, all sounds very Palliser-like. But it remains, to use my own term, a combination archaism, an event from 20 years before the period in which the novel is set, and deliberate distortion. Aberdeen's government fell in 1855 because of the Crimean War, more literally because of a proposal to establish a committee of inquiry into the conduct of the war. The Duke of Omnium's government falls for a very different reason, a franchise issue, which, while echoing Lord John Russell's difficulties in 1851, is nonetheless very much a feature of the 1870s, the decade in which the great political event would be the defeat of the Whig Bill to reform the franchise in June 1866, the same month as it happens as the final plot issue of Trollope's novel, the passing by the Tories of the Second Reform Act in 1867. Plantagenet Palliser has elements of character of Lord Aberdeen, and his government is a version of the Aberdeen coalition of the early 1850s. But they are only elements, and it is only a version. Trollope mixes fact and fiction, realism and fantasy, create his distinctive and I think very brilliant account of the experience of political life. It is real enough not to be trivial. The details are entirely convincing, but not so real that it lapses into mere reportage or mature history writing. The third context, which I want to consider, is to my mind the most important or interesting of them, though its effects on the Prime Minister will require some cross-reference to what I call technical context. This, the literary form, which began to manifest itself in the 1870s. Was prose fiction merely a mode of popular entertainment? Could it, like poetry or drama, also aspire to have a serious aesthetic status? Reviewing Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre in 1847, H. Lewis, again, suggested that realism, or in his words, truth of human nature, can, I quote, lift the novel from the poor level of street conjuring into the exalted region of art, unquote. And 9 years later, in 1856, his partner, Mary Ann Evans, or George Eliot, her again, would develop the idea in her essay, Silly Novels by Lady Novelists. She there noted the lack of what she called rigid requirements, prose fiction, and the ease with which it can be written competently. I quote, in novel writing, there are no barriers for incapacity to stumble against, no external criteria to prevent a writer from mistaking foolish fancy for mastery, unquote. Handled rightly, however, the novel can, she believes, achieve the desideratum of all great art, beauty. I quote her again. Like crystalline masses, it may take any form and yet be beautiful. We have only to pour in the right elements, unquote. Those right elements being, for Mary Ann Evans as for Lewis, chiefly realism, I quote, genuine observation, humour, and passion. Unquote. Well, Trollope's early novels met those criteria, as did George Eliot's. Views began to change in the 1860s, in part because of a growing willingness to look overseas and compare English prose fiction with foreign novels, especially French and Russian novels, in particular the work of Flaubert, Tolstoy, and Turgenev. Flaubert's Madame Bovary was published in the Revue de Paris in 1856 and as a book in 1857. Turgenev, visiting England since 1847, published his Hunter's Notes in 1847 to 51, and it was translated into English by J.D. Middleton in 1855. His Nest of Gentlefolk followed in 1859, On the Eve in 1860, and Father and Son in 1862. And Trollope, incidentally, met him at the London home of, guess who, G.H. Lewis and George Eliot, in April 1871, and helped to arrange his temporary membership of the Athenaeum. Tolstoy's War and Peace was published in 1863-69. In these novels, it seemed, could be found a model of prose fiction as art, which involved some more complex and sophisticated criterion than simply operational realism. The most celebrated statement of these new values, or what these new values might be, would be made by Henry James. His essay, The Art of Fiction, in 1884, he argued that, I quote, the English novel had no air of having a theory, a conviction, a consciousness of itself, being the expression of an artistic faith, result of choice and comparison. A novel is, that is, a novel should be, living thing, all one and continuous, like any other organism. In his essay, James's essay on Flaubert in 1902, he insisted that, I quote, for signal examples of what composition, distribution, arrangement can do, of how they intensify the life of a work of art, we have to go to Flaubert. And in his 1908 preface to the New York edition of his own earlier novel, The Tragic Muse, compared the composition of novels to the composition of paintings, insisting on, I quote, unity and quality of tone, and asking, such novels as Thackeray's The Newcomes, I quote, what do such large, loose, baggy monsters with their queer elements of the accidental and the arbitrary artistically mean? These are all later remarks. James had in fact begun to say such things in the 1870s, notably in his review of Middlemarch, George Eliot, Middlemarch in 1873. I quote, we can well remember how keenly we wondered, while its earlier chapters unfolded themselves, what turn in the way of form the story would take. That of an organized, moulded, balanced composition, gratifying the reader with a sense of design and construction, or a mere chain of episodes, broken into accidental lengths and unconscious of the influence of a plan, unquote. Alas, James was disappointed. I quote, Middlemarch is a treasure house of details. It is an indifferent whole, unquote. Novels in this new understanding should display unity of tone and effect, or organic unity, avoiding irrelevance or redundancy. They should have single, not multiple plots, should show, not tell, should not, that is, use intrusive, omniscient narration, should not be instructive or didactic, and though realist, should use slight rather than conspicuous incident. This would be the agenda for the art novel as it developed in the hands of James, Conrad, Woolf, and Joyce, and separated itself from the mode of popular or commercial fiction. And that split is still very much with us. The Booker Prize novel on the one hand, the popular page turner on the other, in a way which has not been in the era of Dickens, Trollope, and indeed George Eliot, who were popular novelists as well as there is not. Trollope, the Prime Minister, clearly fails to meet or deliberately breaches these new criteria. Has variety of tone, sometimes comic, sometimes tender or sentimental, sometimes dryly rational and analytic. It has multiple plot. Tells, not shows. At the end of chapter 23, for example, there is an authorial intrusion of just the kind that James had denounced in his reviews of other novels. Emily just accepted Lopez's proposal, and we are told, quote, he had but little to say to her, for we know that for lovers lacking matter, cleanliest shift the kiss. In such moments, silence charms, and almost any words are unsuitable except those soft, bird-like murmurings of love, which, sweet as they are to the ear, can hardly be so written as to be sweet to the reader. There is Trollope bringing us into the literary workshop, telling us, you can't write that bit because it's not easy to write. That is authorial intrusion. That is telling, not showing. And the Prime Minister uses conspicuous, even melodramatic incidents when Lopez commits his spectacular suicide in front of an express train. Yet, in the introduction to my edition of the Prime Minister, I claimed that the novel could be seen as a significant development in Trollope's towards new concept novel. Well, in that introduction, I cited Peter Garrett's account of the parallels between different plots. Duke's inability to make acceptable compromises with his coalition partners, and Mr. Wharton's reluctance to make a financial settlement with his son-in-law. Palliser marriage and the Lopez marriage, both in part mercenary arrangement. Mirror imaging of Lopez outsider and Palliser ultimate insider. I think there are also more detailed local instances of correspondence between the apparently diverse elements of this novel which deserve to be acknowledged and appreciated, and I shall now, briefly, before I conclude, point at. The Prime Minister begins with what seems to be a deliberate flaunting of its discordant multi-plot status. The title points us to the Palliser plot. This is a novel about the Duke of Omnium, First Lord of the Treasury, about politics and public events. The first 5 chapters, half of the first part issue, or almost half, are not about him at all. Instead, they're about what the title implies to be a subplot, Ferdinand Lopez and the Wharton family. There is no mention of the Prime Minister until chapter 6, and the last 2 chapters of the first part issue, chapters 9 and 10, are once again not concerned with him or his circle, but are devoted instead to a lengthy account, whole chapters, of a comically or grotesquely unsuccessful dinner party given by Mr. Wharton's sister-in-law, Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Dick's dinner party number 1, and then Mrs. Dick's dinner party number 2. Mrs. Roby, I quote, had secured a lord. This was no less a man than Lord Mongrubber, whose family had been a great judge in the early part of the century and had been made a peer. Mongrubber estates were not supposed to be large, nor was the Mongrubber influence at this time extensive. This nobleman was seen about a good deal in society when the dinners given were supposed to be worth eating. He was a fat, silent, red-faced, elderly gentleman who said very little. When he did speak, seemed always to be in an ill humour. Other diners include the notorious at least, Lady Eustace, with her obscure friend Mrs. Leslie, and some business acquaintances of Ferdinand Lopez. It ends with an open quarrel between Mr. Dick Roby and the objectionable Lord Mongrubber. Mrs. Dick, we know, is giving the dinner party in order to put Emily Wharton into contact with her forbidden boyfriend and to scrape the very bottom of her social barrel to assemble a suitably grand or grandiose set of guests. Chapters seem to be an exercise, successful in its own terms, in Dickensian comic shabby gentility, have nothing to do with the main plot announced in the title of the novel. The 3 chapters in the part issue which are about Plantagenet Palliser, chapters 6 to 8, are chiefly concerned with the difficulty of assembling a suitable set of members for a cabinet. My own efficacy for the present task, Omnium tells Glencora, depends entirely on the cooperation of others, and unfortunately upon that of some others with whom I have no sympathy, nor have they with me. Mrs. Dick's struggle to assemble a list of guests for a dinner party, in other words, esque in itself, is also an ingenious parody of the process of assembling a list of cabinet ministers for a coalition government. And some subsequent dinners, such as the one in chapter 30 at the end of the 3rd part issue, where Mr. Wharton dines with his daughter and son-in-law at their apartment in Belgrave Mansion, where Lopez, I struggled hard to make up a well-sounding party, quote, remind us of this parallel. Sometimes these subtle, unifying parallels rely on the use of a single word. The best example here, I think, is the use of the terms vulgar and vulgarity. Buke's use of the word vulgarity to describe his wife's entertainment at Gatherum Castle in chapter 19, towards the end of the 2nd part issue, is of course one of the crises of the plot. Very significant, this is a slight, rather than melodramatic incident, people talking in private, no bones broken, which accords entirely with the requirements of the art novel, and it is neatly paralleled by the moment in chapter 9, towards the end of the 4th part issue, when Emily first fully acknowledges to herself that she has made a terrible mistake in her choice of husband. I quote, "He could read his mind so far. He endeavoured not to read the book too closely. There it was, open to her wider day by day, and she knew that the lessons which it taught were vulgar and damnable." This is a unity effect achieved not obviously, but ingeniously, and against expectation. But having thus praised and recommended the art or technique of the Prime Minister, I want to end by suggesting what I see as a flaw or failure. And it is to do with that choice of a 4-volume or 8-half-volume part issue format, which I talked about earlier. Trollope's heart or creative instinct was, I suspect, still invested in the old 3-volume format, because this novel seems to me to end or run out of impetus at the conclusion of its 3rd volume, or in chapter 60, the end of part 6. What happens there? Lopez commits his spectacular suicide at Fenway Junction. And once Lopez is dead and gone from the narrative, the fizz goes out of it. We may not like him, we are fascinated by him and by the problems which the other characters have with him. Once he's gone, there are no real problems other than the untroubling payment of some bills. The tension drops, and the 4th volume, 61 to 80, part 7 and 8, is merely, I think, mopping up. Yes, Emily has still to reconcile herself to accepting Arthur Fletcher's proposal. But does any reader ever doubt that it is going to happen? And we are fully aware by then that the coalition is coming to its end. I quote, "It was understood in the political world," in chapter 56, that very strong opposition was to be organised against the government under the guidance of Sir Orlando Drought. What is there left to say which could not have been said in a single chapter, with the suicide moved to chapter 59 and one chapter of conclusion in which the loose ends were efficiently tied up? Above all, the ingenious use of parallel, which had so distinguished the earlier section of the Prime Minister, is abandoned. Emily Wharton and her family have a happy ending. Plantagenet Palliser not. The two strands diverge. Trollope wrote 3 brilliant volumes of a book which goes a long way towards the new avant-garde model of the art novel, but a disappointing 4th volume which does not.